of water. We'll go ahead and get started. And again, I thank everyone for being with us today. Thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to be here, to toss these ideas around. Perhaps you'll agree, perhaps you'll disagree. Doesn't matter. It's processing it. It's taking these and asking yourself, well, what did that mean to me? Rolling them over until they are your own. The Buddhists tell us that we hear something, but then we process it and we make it our own, and we have the understanding of it. And then we process the understanding until we have the realization and we live it, the 3 levels of consciousness that I keep talking about. So let's take these words and these ideas today, and let's challenge ourselves to not just hear them, but to think about them. What do we agree with? What don't we agree with? Why do we agree? Why don't we agree? What other ways might there be to look at these things and process this information to each come to our own understanding, what it means to us, and then invite ourselves to live from that understanding. So we started this month, we looked at the Eightfold Path of Buddhism at the beginning of the month, and it seems to me, as I was preparing for the month, you know, the intuition that I was getting, the guidance that I was getting was kind of pointing me strongly in that direction, that it was important for us to understand that these ideas about breaking out of or awakening from or becoming enlightened, however we want to say it, to be born again, that these ideas that this world that we live in, almost channeled Paul McCartney there, the world that we live in is not what it seems to be, that we are born into it. In Buddhism, the way that they say it is the game of life is already in progress when you and I joined it. That's the way that some of the teachers put it. In other words, we can spend lifetimes trying to figure out why things are the way they are, but that's not as important as understanding the way they are and what we can do to work with them the way they are, and eventually break out of the delusion of believing that things are the way they seem. In other words, to awaken from the idea that we are merely mortal beings, and to arrive at the consciousness that we are consciousness, aware of itself, as Joel Goldsmith says, that we are consciousness unfolding. Excuse me. And in the idea of Buddhism that we started with, is simply address what the theologians call the problem of evil, which is why this pain and suffering exists. And it exists because of error, erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and emotions, ignorance. It exists because we don't fully understand who and what we are, and we misuse the very ability that we have to break out of that cycle. So the excuse me, we have a lot of pollen here with the change in weather, so I apologize. So the idea that we talked about is that there is a way out. There is a way out of the pain and suffering. There is a way out. Pain and suffering exist as part of the human experience, but it doesn't have to be part of the human experience. It is. It just is. And you can say, well, why is it? And again, they would say, well, it doesn't matter why it is, and your task is to figure out how to escape it, how to break out of the wheel, the circle of life, how to stop reliving the pain and suffering. So in Buddhism, the Buddha gave the Eightfold Path, which are kind of the way out, and they involve 3 major segments. which were right action, right doing, stop doing the things that cause pain and suffering. And then there was right thinking, having to understand things properly. And then there's right wisdom, which is basically being that very thing. As I said, we might hear it, but then we understand it, and then we live it. We might do it, then we might understand why it's important to not do the things that are causing pain and suffering, and then eventually we begin to live it. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to close the month with taking a similar view at the Ten Commandments. Right, there's a lot of similarity if you would look at, what is the Eightfold Path and what are the Ten Commandments, and what about other cultures? What about other cultures that seem to have a code to live by? The Ten Commandments, as we understand them, as they come to us in Exodus in the Old Testament, they are a restatement, a truncated statement of an older codes that existed in the Mesopotamian region. So this idea of codes of behavior and codes of conduct and kind of guidelines for people as rules to live by is nothing new. It's nothing. In fact, every culture is defined by its values. And in every culture are certain taboos, things that you just don't do because they're against the rules, whether the rules are written down or not. They're against the rules of that culture. And if one breaks a taboo, one has to experience the social consequences of it. And usually it's some form of ostracization, some form of being put outside the community, a mark on the head, and the scarlet letter in colonial times. Those sorts of things. The idea was that if somebody breaks a rule, they are pushed out of society. You can't live in our society and break the rules, and we will push you out. So we have codes of conduct, in terms of an Eightfold Path and in terms of the Ten Commandments, but there's a deeper meaning there. There's a deeper meaning. So what I wanted to look at is, I'm holding up for those on YouTube a copy of Emmet Fox's book, The Ten Commandments. And Emmet Fox, I've told you before, Emmet Fox is one of my favorite New Thought teachers. Just by way of a brief biography, is Emmet Fox was the front man for Thomas Troward. And you've heard me talk of Thomas Troward as having a great influence on Dr. Holmes. Troward was giving what they called higher thought or new thought lectures. First it started as higher thought in England. And Emmet Fox, who had been an electrical engineer, Emmet Fox was the front man. So he would get into town before Troward. He would rent the meeting hall. He would put the ads in the paper. He would run the flyers and have them posted all over town. He would sell the tickets, all the thing that you would expect an advanced man to do. And Emmet Fox, later on in life, decided that he wanted to teach, and his goal in teaching was to make things as simple as possible. Thomas Troward was a judge, and he tended to teach as if he was giving a lecture in law school. And everything was presented there was a major premise, there was a minor premise, and strict rules of logic that perhaps might have been lost on the layman at the time. In addition, most of what we have of Troward's teaching comes to us in the form of somebody had transcribed his lectures. So he was speaking to an audience and somebody was writing it down, and then later on they went back and they tried to punctuate it and they tried to make sense of it. And it's pretty difficult to read because some of the sentences in his works are a paragraph long. It's just kind of strung together with different punctuation marks. So Emmet Fox said he wanted to come out. He just wanted to make things accessible. He just wanted to make these deep truths easy for the ordinary person to understand. And because of that, and I think because of who he was, he spoke with an ease, with a colloquialism that could put things in terms that people could look at, they could understand, they could chuckle at. They could get a little laugh out of what he was saying. But it was always profound. It's the kind of thing that if you read just a little bit of it, you have to put the book down for a while because it's so profound. Just a side note here, Troward was Anglican. And Trower never felt that by studying New Thought and teaching New Thought that he had departed from the Anglican Church, but rather he felt that he was kind of taking Christianity as he had been taught to the next level, so to speak, to a deeper level. And in fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury apparently knew Trower. They knew of each other, and the Archbishop of Canterbury would use some of Trower's work on a Sunday, delivering his sermon. Emmet Fox, in a similar fashion, was raised Roman Catholic, and at one point somebody asked him why he abandoned Catholicism, and he said he never did abandon Catholicism, but he felt that he had taken his Catholicism to the next level, to a deeper level of understanding. And I think that that's important to bring up, because what these gentlemen were saying is, if you go back and you look at what we have been raised with in the scriptures of different cultures over the years, if we can break out of the literal interpretation and try to understand what it is that they're telling us for the growth of our soul, what we start to find is that they're all trying to tell us the same thing. The Eightfold Path of Buddhism, the Ten Commandments, all of these different ways of kind of looking at this idea that you are not what you seem to be as a material being, but you are a spiritual being and you must awaken to it. So Emmet Fox set out and he wrote his book, The Ten Commandments. He also wrote another book that was very popular called The Sermon on the Mount, where he looks at Matthew 5, 6, and 7, which is the part of the New Testament that talks about the Sermon on the Mount. And he summarizes that as the essential teaching of Jesus, not the teaching about Jesus. And just a side note on that is that some of the people who attended Emmet Fox's lectures in New York City were associated with the founding of AA. And before the Blue Book came to be in AA, they actually used, or so the story goes, they actually used Emmet Fox's Sermon on the Mount as kind of a book for studying. So Emmet Fox in his book, The Ten Commandments, comes back and he says, we have this beautiful instruction book. We have this beautiful piece of literature called the Bible. He says, and people read it every day, all over the world. And some people read it every day for 40 years. But they don't necessarily get it. Right? They miss the message. He says it's possible to read the Bible from beginning to end and do it many times in the course of a lifetime and still miss the message because people don't have the key to understanding, as he calls it, the metaphysical key or the spiritual key. And he set out to start to write the Ten Commandments to help us understand that. And his idea of the spiritual key is that, first of all, he says, every Bible should have stamped on the cover, this means me. This means me. That the Bible is a book about each and every one of us, and that we are, in fact, each and every character in the Bible. In other words, each character in the Bible represents a certain state of consciousness. And you and I are familiar with those states of consciousness. Right? This is the psychology of humanity. It's all part of us. So we understand the Pharaoh consciousness. We understand the Moses consciousness. We understand the Christ consciousness. And if you look at the way that the Bible is laid out, it's kind of a guidebook for the evolution of our soul until we all come to that final chapter, the Revelation. Right? The last chapter of the New Testament is the book of Revelation. It is about John having the mystical experience, the experience of cosmic consciousness, the experience of realizing the unity with all life, the unity with the divine. I and the Father are one kind of consciousness. And that is where the soul is going. If you look at the way that the Bible is laid out, it starts with the soul in the Garden of Eden, and it leaves the Garden of Eden to go out on this quest to understand the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. And it's not necessarily a punishment and being outcast as much as it is the natural inquisition of the intellect. It has to know, or it wants to know. And we left that place, excuse me, that place called the garden, which in some cultures is not a place here on earth, right? It's not a town in the Middle East or a section in the Middle East, but rather it represents a time and place in eternity before we were born, when the souls were in heaven, if you will. And they decided that they had to leave heaven to go out and have an experience that seemed real, but then to awaken from that experience. And in that process, each and every soul would develop as an individual, which is what you and I are doing. And then we would learn to express the life of the divine in an individualized manner, not separated from God, but in an individualized expression of God. So as humanity set out on its own to try to figure out this thing called life and how it works, we create many problems for ourselves. We get ourselves in a lot of trouble. All I can think of is when I was a kid on Saturday afternoons, we would watch the black and white TV, and they always had like 3 or 4 Laurel and Hardy movies running, and they always seemed to end with, well, that was another fine mess you've gotten us into. And as human beings, we tend to have that experience in life. If you look at human nature, we go from mess to mess to mess. So what Emmet Fox is telling us to consider is that if you look at where the Ten Commandments, where the story of the Ten Commandments comes into the Bible, it comes in the book of Exodus. And Exodus is the way out of trouble. So the Eightfold Path is the way out of the circle of life, the way out of the wheel of life, the way out of pain and suffering into the realization of consciousness. And the Ten Commandments come to us in the book of Exodus because they too represent the way out of the suffering that humanity brings to itself. But they represent a way out not so much because of the rules of conduct. Excuse me. I do apologize. Not because of the rules of conduct that they give to us. As I say, those rules of conduct have existed for a long time. And people have known for a long time that, you just don't go around stealing everybody else's stuff. But there's a deeper meaning. And what Emmet is telling us is that, people have to work at the level that they're at. They have to start where they are. And that's a big fallacy in our culture is we always think we can start someplace else. And you've got to start where you are. Right where you are. And not everybody is ready for the deeper meaning yet. Not everybody is there. So the Bible, according to Emmet Fox, the Bible works on several layers. And he says it's like digging diamonds in the clay. You hit one level of clay a certain color and there's a great deal of diamonds there. But if you keep digging, the clay turns to a blue color and there's even more diamonds there. So as our soul grows, as we grow in consciousness, we are able to discern more and more deeper truth out of the same words that were there the last time that we read them. And this is the way that the Bible works. For those who need to be reminded that you shouldn't steal your neighbor's stuff and there are consequences for that, the commandments serve as a code of conduct, and that's good enough. That's good enough for the folks at that level. That's a place to start. This is right doing, the equivalent in the Eightfold Path. But there's a deeper meaning there, and as we grow spiritually, we start to want that deeper meaning. We want to know what that is. So again, Dr. Fox kind of put things in a way that you could understand, and in a way sometimes it brings a chuckle. And he asks us to consider, the setting that God itself has come down from wherever God is. Right? And of course, this is a teaching story. This is not. There's not a God out there and a place over here, right? It's all God. But in the story, the idea has that God has come down and descended upon the mountain. See? And the ordinary people, well, they weren't worthy to go up the mountain. They had to stay down the bottom of the mountain because they weren't worthy to go up the mountain. But Moses was able to go up to the top of the mountain. And Moses had this burning bush experience there. And Moses was given the 10 Commandments. And the ground shook, and there was lightning, and there was earthquakes, and there was clouds, and there was darkness, and there was smoke. And God said, tell them not to steal each other's shoes. And Emmet Fox says that with a smirk on his mouth, indicating there's a deeper meaning here. There's a deeper meaning here. Yes, not stealing each other's shoes is a good thing. But do you really think that God came all the way from wherever God was and shook the ground just to tell them how to behave? So at some point we start to kind of crave that deeper meaning, that deeper understanding. And that's what he tries to tell us in his review of the 10 Commandments. So when he goes into this, I'm just going to touch on briefly on his explanation and kind of draw out a little bit, on how it relates to what we teach and how we live. But I do hope that you find a copy of the book. It's still for sale. It's been for sale for a number of years. You may even find it, in Google Books or in a PDF format somewhere on the internet. But it's certainly worth an addition to your home library. I think it's one that you go back to over and over again. So Emmet Fox starts out by saying he's going to present things in a slightly different order than they were written down. And he says it's easier to understand. It's easier to understand kind of that what the Bible is doing is it is telling us the laws of life. It is telling us the way that life works. It is telling us about consciousness. It is telling us about evolving our soul. And it is not just about how to behave, although behaving properly is a good thing. We must remember that our actions are an outpicturing or a reflection of our deeper beliefs. So truly, if we want to have a lasting change in our behavior, that lasting change has to come through a change in consciousness. And we see this all the time in life. We try to do things in life through willpower. We try to make ourselves do something that we really don't want to do. Excuse me while I get a drink. Diet or exercise or study hard or work hard or something, that somehow we convince ourselves that I'm going to make this hard. I'm going to get in here and I'm going to force myself to do it. And of course that lasts only as long as we can keep our willpower focused on it. And what Emmet Fox tells us is that willpower is a poor substitution for God power. What we want to do is make a change in the underlying consciousness, and then those behaviors, those things that we wanted to do will come naturally to us. They will come easily and we will go ahead and do them. So Emmet Fox starts with the commandment, thou shalt not steal. And he starts with that because he says what it's really telling us is by right of consciousness is what that really means. By right of consciousness. He says stop and think about that. Stop and think about it for a minute. We are spiritual beings, and the activity of spirit is an activity in consciousness. Thought is a movement within consciousness. The divine is pure consciousness. The divine creates by a movement within itself, by a thought. and it is pure consciousness. And what it thinks, what it desires, what it decrees, if you will, what it declares, and it says, let it be, something acts upon that. Something acts upon that and brings it into fruition and makes it so. And the commandment, thou shalt not steal, is telling us that whatever we have in our experience, we have by right of consciousness. And if we try to acquire anything that we don't have the consciousness for, we'll lose it. You can't steal it. You don't have the consciousness for it. You can't steal. It's impossible. You can try, but the results will be the same. You will lose whatever it is that you tried to acquire without having the proper consciousness to acquire it. Now, I mean, just think about that. Just think about that for a moment and look at what is being pitched to us in advertising, on the TV and in magazines and on the radio and every place else. The easy way out. The easy way out. Fake it. You don't have to have it, but you can fake it. You know. When we were living in Wilmington, the radio stations were running an ad for some product. I don't remember who sold it, but the basic idea of the commercial, excuse me, was you can eat whatever you want, you can drink whatever you want, you can go home tonight and you can eat an 18-inch pizza and you can wash it down with a 6-pack of beer, and all you have to do is take this one little pill before you go to bed. And this magical pill is going to quick start your metabolism, and it's going to run at a super induced rate while you're asleep, and you're actually going to burn off all of those calories that you consumed before you went to bed and then some, you know. And that's kind of like the snake oil salesman's dream, right? That's kind of like what it seems that the ad men are selling us. They're selling us a false promise. They're telling us you can do this without having the consciousness to do it. Why do the Ponzi schemes work so well? Why is somebody like Bernie Madoff able to go get people to continue to invest, expecting an exorbitant rate of return, which anybody with any sense knows is impossible? And we do it because we want something for nothing. Right? We don't want to have the consciousness that goes with supply. What we want to have is we want to have somebody give it to us. Somebody give it to us the easy way. And what Emmet Fox is telling us is the first and most important thing we have to understand is that all of life, excuse me, the life that we know here, the life that we'll know after we leave here, all of life is a matter of consciousness. And rather than trying to grab things that we don't have the consciousness for, including our spiritual growth, rather than trying to get things through superficial means, rituals and all these other things, that what we need to do is we need to understand that we have to develop the consciousness for them. And we develop that consciousness through our prayer, through our meditation, through our spiritual mind treatment. You remember Moses comes into the picture of the Bible as a baby. And that baby is put into a little basket that's made watertight, and it's floated on the river, so the Pharaoh's daughter will find it. And the Pharaoh's daughter finds it and decides that she wants to raise it on her own, but she can't take care of it. She can't provide for it. She needs a wet nurse. So Moses' sister was hanging out in the bushes waiting for that moment that the Pharaoh's daughter would find the baby. And Moses' sister tells the Pharaoh's daughter, I know a wet nurse who can take care of this child for you. So Moses' own mother comes back, and the Pharaoh's daughter says to her, take care of him, nurture him, and I will give you your wages. And what Dr. Fox is telling us is that we are all, in this story, we are all Moses and we are all the Pharaoh's daughter. The Pharaoh's daughter represents that part of us that is awakening to our spiritual growth. The name Moses means to be drawn out of water, and water symbolizes consciousness. There's something in our consciousness that wants to arise to lead us out of our confusion, but it has to be nurtured. And you and I are the only ones who can nurture it. And we do that through our spiritual practice. This leads us to another commandment, and you will remember the commandment where God says, I am the Lord thy God, and you shall not take my name in vain. Now, when I was a kid, we were taught that you shouldn't swear. You should invoke God's name to damn things and stuff like that. But the deeper meaning of this is that you cannot take God's name in vain. Emmet Fox tells us to consider where it says shall not. Try to reinterpret that as meaning you cannot. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. It's impossible to do that. And what he's telling us here, what this commandment means, is what your idea of God is going to influence your entire life. That whatever your idea of God is, that is the way your life is going to be lived. You cannot take it in vain. You have to experience the consequences of your idea of God. Because everything is consciousness, by right of consciousness. And if your idea of God is that God is one who inflicts punishment and suffering upon its creation, then you shall experience the suffering and the punishment, which our society largely believes. If we believe that God has enemies, then we shall have enemies. I mean, how many times you see people whose fundamental idea is that if I am holy, then I'm going to be persecuted. So the more I'm persecuted, the holier I am. So then they go out and they do absolutely atrocious things. I'm talking about people in public life. And when the media turns to them and points out the horrible things that they've done, their response is, well, I must be good because you're persecuting me. And it's easy to see that they're acting out of a fundamental belief that I want to be holy, but to be holy is to be persecuted. So if I do something stupid, which is probably not a deliberate, conscious choice, but a subliminal choice. But if I do something stupid, people will persecute me, and then I'll get to have it reinforced how holy I am. You see this with televangelists when they're caught up in scandals and things like that. That's what I'm talking about. But it's not just about somebody else. It's about us. So what is your concept of God? What is your idea of God? And do you recognize that you cannot take that in vain? That whatever you believe to be true about God is something that is true about you, and that you will continue to live your life in that manner because of your concept of God. So what he's asking us to do here is to reflect upon it. What is your idea of God? Has it changed since you were a little kid, perhaps in Sunday school or catechism? Is God an old person with a long white beard sitting up in the sky, judging everybody, who's good and who's bad? The Santa Claus kind of God? Who's been naughty, who's been nice, who's going to get coal in their stocking? That's exactly what our society has done, is we have taken that idea of God and we have moved it down to Santa Claus. And then marketing got a hold of it, and they moved Santa Claus into a department store and turned it into a holiday of buying. People are acting out of their consciousness, out of their idea of God. The two are associated, and they may or may not even notice it. So what Dr. Fox is telling us is that once we recognize that everything is done to us by right of consciousness, then what we have to do is we have to realize that our idea of God is the most important part of our consciousness. What we believe to be true about God is the most important part of our consciousness. Which then leads us to the commandment that says, have no other gods before me. Have no other gods before me. And what he's telling us here is, this means I am that I am. It says, I am the Lord thy God, have no other gods before me. And we have to understand that this simple idea of this I amness, or as the Buddhists might call the suchness of life, it is just simply that the way that God is. And what happens to us is we have these false ideas. We have these erroneous ideas of what God is. And we have this idea that was given to us in this story of Exodus, that only Moses could go up the mountain. See, everybody else wasn't worthy. Everybody else had to stay down at the foot of the mountain and look up and see the dark cloud. And we're denying our I amness. We're denying the part of us that is of God, that is the expression of God. And we are looking for other people to do our spiritual growth for us. We're looking for the clergy to do it for us. We're looking for the people who put on the seminars to do it for us. We're looking for somebody else to go up that mountain for us. And what we have to recognize is that we are the only ones. We are the I am in our lives. We are the only ones who can do our spiritual growth for ourselves. And the thing that made people unworthy to go up the mountain was their belief that they were unworthy. And that what our job is to raise our beliefs through our spiritual practice, through our prayer, through our meditation, through our spiritual mind treatment, to let go of ideas of unworthiness, to let go of ideas that somebody else is going to do it for us, particularly if somebody else tells us that they're going to do it for us if we will only pay them, if we will only send them money. We have to start to recognize everything is by right of consciousness because we are already spiritual beings. It's not that we are going to become spiritual beings at some point in the future. It is that we are already spiritual beings and we are already unfolding in that consciousness. We are already growing in that consciousness. And nobody else is going to do it for us. Excuse me. So again, he asks us, what have you put between yourself and God? What ideas you have about what has to happen before you are worthy to go up that mountain in your consciousness? What has to happen in order for you to awaken to your spiritual nature? And whatever that is, we have to dissolve it. Dr. Holmes tells us that anything that we have put between ourselves and God must ultimately be absorbed, must be dissolved. Right? There's no person who is holier than you are. There's no person who is more spiritual than you are. It is claiming that I amness. It is awakening to the fact that the love of God has created you out of itself, is calling you to itself, and nobody else can answer for you. Nobody else can. So what we want to do then, excuse me, is not to have other gods before God. Right? The presence of God is right here where we are. The only place that we're going to find it is in our own consciousness. The only place we are going to experience it is in our own consciousness. And there is no one else who can do that for us. And this then leads into the commandment that says, have no graven images, right? Have no idols. And of course, when I was a kid growing up, I never did understand that. We thought, people cast statues of golden calves and they worship them. Well, how silly was that? We don't do that today. We had little statues of saints everywhere. We had little medals around our necks, but we thought that the people who were worshiping golden calves was what this commandment was about. And what Dr. Fox is telling us here is that we we like to say, well, God is all there is and God is perfect, whole, and complete. And then we immediately give away all that power to our graven, our graven images. We start to talk about our aches and pains as if they had a reality of their own, as if they had a control over our lives all of their own. And we forget who we are. We forget our I amness. We forget the spirituality of the situation. We think that we are spiritual beings, but our good depends upon our aches and pains. We look to the indexes on Wall Street to decide whether or not we feel good about our finances, instead of recognizing that the amount of supply in our life is a function of our consciousness. It has very little to do with what's going on Wall Street. Right, when Wall Street's going up, lots of people make money, and when Wall Street's going down, there are still lots of people who make lots of money. Excuse me. They know how to work that system. They understand that system. So if we get up in the morning and think, well, the Dow Jones has gone down today, I'm ruined, it is because we have made the Dow Jones Industrial Average our graven image, instead of recognizing that the good in our life is only from God. And no matter how it gets to us, it is only from God. So what do we have in our lives where we're relying on it rather than relying on our connection with God, is what that means. You know, do we think that the job that we have comes to us only because of our wit and our resume and our assertiveness and all those things? Are we relying totally on our ego and our intellect to move us forward in the world? If so, that's our graven image. If so, we need to back up and realize that our good is only a result of our connection with God. And if we work on deepening our connection with God, then our good comes to us in many ways. Right? Get the ego out of the way. We don't have to make it happen. Certainly we do things. Certainly we update resumes and we apply for positions. But the idea is that instead of us trying to make it happen, we're doing it because it is an expression, excuse me, an expression of who and what we are. This leads us then to the commandment that says not to bear false witness. And what he's telling us here is, it means that at all times we should be bearing true witness. Instead of acting like a mere mortal human being, subjects to the whim of the world, we have to start acting as the spiritual being that we are. When we are presented with something in our life, an opportunity, a challenge, do we approach it as the spiritual being that we are? Right? Many times what happens is something comes up in our life and right away the intellect and the ego go to work on it. Right? The intellect starts trying to figure out how to solve the problem. The ego starts figuring out who it's going to have to convince or overpower, if you will, in order to get its way. And instead, can we stop and say, well, wait a second. Wait a second, you know, I'm a spiritual being. Everything is unfolding in my life perfectly. Everything is by right of consciousness. Can I stop for a moment and claim in consciousness the experience that I wish to have? And let the spiritual power of the universe that responds to our word to work in our highest good, to work in our best interest. You know, I think so many times we get ourselves engaged in a struggle because things aren't going the way that we want them to go or we expect them to go. And they shouldn't be going that way anyway. I think it's Rumi who says that. Who are we to look at what's happening and say, well, it's not right? Maybe it's perfectly right. Maybe that's not the right answer. You know, maybe that job that we had hoped for isn't the right job. Maybe the circumstances that we were driving for are not the right circumstances. Maybe we have to just let them go so that we can move on to something else. You know, I've had that happen in my own life where I went to interview for a job position, and it took me about 10 minutes in the conversation to realize that wasn't right for me. This was somebody else's job, but not mine. Excuse me. And I told him, I said, well, thank you very much for your time, but this is not for me. This is obviously for somebody else. So there's no sense wasting time, your time or mine. Excuse me. I will go back and do other things. And my point is that when our ego gets involved, our ego wants to win, even if it's not the right one for us, right? Even if it's not the right job for us. We don't want to be the one. We don't want to be the one who didn't get chosen. You know, we want to be the one who's chosen, even if it's not right for us. I don't know how many people we have out there in corporate America are working at jobs that aren't right because they won. You know, hey, but I won. So what we want to do is we want to be the true witness. We want to go forward living life as the spiritual beings that we are. He then leads us in his logic to the commandment, thou shalt not kill. And what he tells us what that really means is you have to express what you are. You have to express the true spiritual being that you are. First of all, we can't kill, right? Because life is eternal. We can murder, but we can't kill. That's the way he puts it. And the only one who can truly kill us, if there is such a thing as being killed, is ourselves. By frustrating and suppressing and resisting that spiritual being that we are. So what we have to learn to do is to rely back on our true nature. Stop living in this world as if we were just human beings. Rely on our true nature. What is it that we've come here to express? How have we come here to serve? And I can't tell you, our society is so screwed up when it comes to this. We have this belief that artists must starve, that if you try to express yourself, that you're going to starve to death. And society has really set up the rules to kind of make it so, to make it that way. You can see right now in some of our states that the politicians are stripping money away from the humanities programs in schools because there's no practical value to those. They don't produce hourly wages. And they're attacking those very things that provide for self-expression. And we have to stop and turn around and say, I understand that that's the way the rules of society work, but I am being guided and provided for by a higher set of rules. I have to be true to my own self. I have to be true to the growth of my soul. What is most important to me here is not how much money I make, how much money I leave behind when I die, how big a tombstone they put over my grave. What is important to me is that I find my own soul. And in order to do that, I have to be true to that in every decision that I make, every minute of every day. Which leads us to honor your father and mother. Who are your father and your mother? And they're God. God is the father and the mother. Your circumstances in your life are produced by law of mind operating through your consciousness because God is your father and your mother. So rather than worrying about how to manipulate and force things to happen and all of those other things that we do in order to try to go out there and make it happen through intellect and ego, can we honor our father and mother? Can we go back to the very simple things that we know, that we are spiritual beings and that we do our spiritual practice and we grow in consciousness, and then the demonstration occurs. And there's a whole group of commandments that have to do with coveting and adultery and basically wanting something that is not ours by right of consciousness. Advertising just plays off of this. If you have this car, your neighbors will be jealous, and we have to keep up with the Joneses. And what we need to understand quite simply is that if life is done unto us by right of consciousness, we don't need to covet anything. Because whatever is ours by right of consciousness appears in our life. And if we want to have something else, we just have to develop the consciousness that goes with it, or the mental equivalent, as Emmet Fox would say. Again, excuse me. So if we find ourselves coveting something, if we look at something and say, oh, I wish I had one of those, fancy red sports cars, whatever it may be, we just have to take that as a reflection that we are still working at the level of human consciousness, material consciousness. and we are not being true to ourselves, we're not being the true witness and telling ourselves that life is done unto us according to our belief. And it gets into something deeper, because then we say, well, is life about the materialism? Is it about having stuff? Is it about having the bigger and the faster car? There's nothing wrong with having a nice car. But why do we want it? What is it about it? Remember, any car that you go and look at is going to be in the junkyard in a period of time. It's turning to rust. From the day you buy it, it's turning to rust. So why do you want it? Are you trying to fulfill yourself by getting stuff out there and bringing it in? Or are you trying to experience the fulfillment that's already within by letting it come out? So that's what all of the rules about coveting are about. And then finally, he brings us to the commandment about keeping holy the Sabbath. And he puts that last because it's telling us about, at some point we have to stop and trust and turn it over to the law. Right? In terms of spiritual mind treatment, it's the fifth step. It's called surrender. And in many cases, it's the hardest one. People want to do their treatment work. They want to recognize I'm a spiritual being. There's a power in the universe that responds to me according to my belief. What God wants from me is for the growth of my soul. And I turn this over to the power that knows what to do. And then we want to go out and kind of see if it's working, kind of help it along. And the example that many metaphysical teachers use is it's kind of like planting potatoes in the backyard and going out every day to dig them up to see if they're growing. You kill them. And the reason for that is that you're digging them up is verification that you're not quite sure. You don't quite believe that this power is working. And what Emmet Fox is telling us is that at some point we're going to have to sit back, relax, and trust. We've done our work. We've put the seed into the soil, and we're going to have to sit back and trust. And that Sabbath day then grows in our lives from just one day a week to every minute of every day, that we are growing into the trust that God loves us and cares for us and is doing what needs to be done on our behalf. Again, I apologize for this, but I'm having a little bit of sinus issue here this morning. So to sum this up, what we want to come back to is it doesn't matter exactly which approach you kind of take. We started with the Buddhist approach. We're kind of ending with an approach that covers the people of the book, the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims, because Exodus kind of covers all of those. And it covers more. I mean, there's other cultures that have rules of conduct. But what we're saying is that these are more than rules of conduct. These are guidelines for the growth of your soul. This is the path. In Buddhism, we had the eightfold path. Here we have a tenfold path. And what the path is telling us about is it about consciousness. It is not just about behavior. Yes, behavior follows consciousness. If you don't have the consciousness yet, then behaving as if you did is okay, it's good. But don't just keep trying to fake it, because you can't steal. You have to develop the consciousness. So if you want to think of yourself as a spiritual being on a journey of consciousness unfolding, a journey of discovering what God as you is, excuse me, then what we have to do is we have to do our spiritual practice. We have to take our time daily to do our treatment, to do our meditation, to do our readings, our inspiration, listening to talks, all those sorts of things, until we get to the point, as Dr. Holmes tells us, where our instruction comes directly from the knower within. And so we start to arrive at the place of being. We start to leave the place of knowing because somebody else told us it's so, of knowing because we have experienced it ourselves, and of knowing because there's a knower within that already knows, that's already telling us. The most important thing in our lives is the growth of our soul, which simply means our rediscovering the true spiritual nature that we are. The way to do that is presented to us in the Ten Commandments. It is presented to us in the Eightfold Path. It's presented to us in many ways. But not one of these ways will work if we do not work with it. There is no one else who can do it for us. There is just can't be done. We have been created as individuals. We have been given freedom of choice. We have been given all of the information that we need to point us in the right direction. But if we won't step on that path, if we won't begin the journey with a single footstep, then all of the teachings in all of the world won't do us any good. So I invite you today to consider how important is your spiritual growth in your life, and what are you willing to do to continue that unfoldment, to develop your practice, to expand your practice, to improve your practice perhaps, to begin living as a true witness, to begin living your life as the spiritual being that you truly are, to let the drama of the world go off and be its own drama. Let that level of consciousness do what it needs to do to awaken, to bring consequences upon itself, until finally one day it says there's got to be a better way. But can we step forward? Can we take that step forward? Can we awaken from the Adam dream? Can we move into the consciousness that says, I am part of the I am? And I think we can. So take some time today, take some time this week, and give it some thought. Push back at these ideas, roll these ideas around, decide which ones you like, decide which ones you don't like, make them your own. And if you can, pick up a copy of Dr. Fox's book and read it all the way through. And so it is.